It was a quiet Saturday morning when he decided to finally clean out his late uncle's old storage shed. The shed had been sitting there for years, tucked behind the small house he grew up near. Dust had settled over everything, and cobwebs hung from the corners like delicate curtains. He had walked past it countless times, always telling himself he would go through it someday. But today, something pushed him to actually do it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the memory of his uncle, who always loved keeping strange things in strange places. He opened the creaking door, and a cloud of dust puffed into the air. He coughed lightly, waving his hand in front of his face, trying to clear it. The smell of old wood, damp cardboard, and something faintly metallic filled the air. He had to step carefully because boxes were stacked everywhere, teetering dangerously. Old furniture, broken chairs, and random tools were scattered around. It was like stepping into a forgotten world, a place where time had stopped. As he moved boxes aside, his hand brushed against something unusual. At first he thought it was just another box, but there was something different about it. It was small, made of dark wood and unlike anything else in the shed. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings, almost delicate in their detail. He ran his fingers over the patterns, feeling the rough edges and wondering how something like this ended up here. The box had a rusty lock and it looked heavy for its size. Something inside made him pause. He hesitated. There was no reason to open it. Who knew what could be inside? But the curiosity gnawed at him. Something about the box felt strange, almost alive. He took a deep breath, grabbed a small crowbar from the shelf, and pried the lock open. The rusty metal protested with a sharp screech echoing in the quiet shed. For a moment, nothing happened. Just the smell of old wood and dust. Then he lifted the lid and froze. Inside the box was a young woman. At first, his mind refused to accept it. He blinked rapidly, rubbed his eyes, even leaned closer to make sure he wasn't imagining things. But she was real. She was curled up, small and trembling, her clothes dirty and torn. Her eyes opened slowly, wide with fear and confusion. Her hair was matted, and she looked like she had not seen the sun in days. Shock rooted him to the spot. He didn't know what to do. He had never seen anything like this in his life. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. The woman whispered something, barely audible, and it sounded like the word, "help." Instinct took over. He carefully reached into the box and helped her out. She was lighter than he expected, almost fragile in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, and he could feel her trembling against him. His heart pounded in his chest. How had she ended up here? Who could have done this? And most importantly, how long had she been trapped inside this small dark box? He set her down gently on an old blanket he pulled from a nearby chair. She flinched at first, but slowly she began to calm down. He asked her questions, but her answers were soft, fragmented, and difficult to understand. She seemed disoriented, as if she was still trapped in the confusion of whatever had happened to her. Every word she spoke made his stomach churn. There was no time to think clearly. He needed help. He ran to his phone and called the local emergency number, his hands shaking as he explained the situation. The operator's voice was calm but firm, and she assured him that help was on the way. He returned to the woman, holding her hand gently. She flinched but did not pull away. His mind raced with a mix of fear, guilt, and worry. He had never imagined a morning like this, starting with dust and ending with a life he didn't even know he was meant to save. Minutes felt like hours. Every sound in the shed, the creak of the door, the distant birds outside, even the faint ticking of an old clock seemed magnified. He kept talking to her, telling her she was safe now, that help was coming. He noticed small details. Her shoes were missing, her fingers were bruised, and she shivered despite the thick blanket. Something told him that whatever had happened, it was more than just being trapped. By the time the sound of sirens reached the neighborhood, he had become a quiet witness to a mystery that seemed impossible. A strange wooden box had hidden a young woman's life inside it, and now everything had changed. He would never look at old boxes the same way again. The moment the woman emerged from the wooden box, a wave of disbelief washed over him. He had never expected to see a human being in something so small. It was impossible. He stepped back instinctively, as if distancing himself could somehow make the situation less real. But the soft, shaky breathing and the wide, fearful eyes staring at him told him everything he needed to know. She was alive, and she needed help fast. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and there were dark bruises forming on her arms and legs. Her clothes were torn and covered in dirt, and her hair clung to her face in damp, tangled strands. She shivered violently, curling into herself as if the very air around her was dangerous. He felt a lump in his throat, the kind of emotion that mixes fear, guilt, and compassion into one heavy feeling. He wanted to scream, to cry, and to do something, anything, all at once. "Are you okay?" he asked cautiously, unsure if she could even understand him. His voice sounded strange in the quiet shed, too loud and too soft at the same time. She tried to speak, but her lips barely moved. "Help, please," she whispered. The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of everything she had endured. Her voice was fragile, almost breaking, and it made his heart tighten painfully. He scanned the shed quickly for anything that could help. There was an old blanket draped over a broken chair. He carefully lifted it and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. The warmth seemed to comfort her slightly, and for the first time she relaxed enough to let him hold her hand gently. Her fingers were cold and weak, barely gripping his. He could feel his own hands shaking as he tried to assess her condition. Her breathing was uneven, sometimes shallow, sometimes catching in sudden gasps. Her eyes darted around the room nervously, as if she expected the walls themselves to attack her. It was clear she had been through something traumatic. The thought that someone had put her in that box and possibly locked her there for days or weeks made his stomach churn. He ran to his phone and dialed the emergency number again, trying not to panic. "There's a woman. A young woman. She's been trapped," he stammered, explaining everything as calmly as he could. The operator's calm voice was a small relief. "Help is on the way," she said, asking him to stay on the line and keep talking to the woman until the paramedics arrived. He returned to her side, kneeling carefully so as not to frighten her. "You're safe now," he said softly. "Help is coming. You're not alone." She blinked at him and he could see the tears in her eyes. Her lips trembled, and she tried to nod, but the effort seemed exhausting. He wanted to hold her, to comfort her, but he didn't want to make her more scared. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every minute felt like an hour as they waited. He noticed the little things. Her hands were scratched, her nails dirty and broken. Her knees were scraped and bruised. Small cuts on her arms oozed a faint line of blood. The smell of dust and decay still lingered in the shed, and he realized that she must have been trapped in that box for days without proper food or water. Her eyes occasionally flicked to the box, and he could see the terror in them. It was as if the memory of being locked inside was still fresh, still alive in her mind. He tried to keep her distracted. He talked about simple things, the way sunlight fell on the trees outside, the sound of birds chirping, anything that could anchor her to the present. Gradually, she seemed to listen, her eyes softening a little as she focused on him instead of the shadows of the shed. Finally, the distant sound of sirens broke the heavy silence. He felt a rush of relief, knowing that trained help was almost there. The woman stiffened slightly, fear flickering in her eyes again, but he gently squeezed her hand. "It's okay. They're here to help you," he said. Paramedics arrived quickly, moving with practiced efficiency. They knelt beside her, asking her a few questions while checking her vital signs. She responded weakly, sometimes nodding, sometimes shaking her head. They lifted her carefully onto a stretcher, making sure the blanket stayed wrapped around her. Before she was taken away, she looked at him again. Her eyes were filled with something he couldn't quite read: fear, gratitude, confusion, and maybe a tiny spark of hope. She whispered something barely audible. He leaned in. "Thank you," she said, and then she was gone, slipping away with the paramedics through the shed door. He stood there in silence, staring at the empty box. It felt impossibly small now, the kind of place that should never have held a person. His mind raced with questions. How did this happen? Who could have done this? How long had she been trapped? And most pressing of all, why had it ended up here in his uncle's shed? The reality of what had just happened slowly settled in. He had uncovered something unimaginable, something terrifying. Yet he had also saved a life. He realized that his ordinary morning, which had started with dust and memories, had turned into an extraordinary and horrifying event that would stay with him forever. Even as the paramedics drove away, he couldn't shake the image of her frightened eyes, the tiny figure curled up inside the wooden box. The world outside the shed seemed different now, quieter, sharper. Something had shifted, and he knew that life would never feel ordinary again. He carefully closed the box, now empty, and carried it to the corner of the shed. It felt heavier than ever, not just with wood, but with the weight of a secret, a story, and a life he could never forget. The ambulance arrived faster than he had expected, its sirens cutting through the quiet neighborhood and echoing off the walls of the small houses nearby. Paramedics jumped out with professional calm, carrying their equipment as if they had seen everything before. But he knew that nothing could have prepared anyone for this. They knelt beside the young woman, checking her pulse and breathing, speaking softly to calm her. Her eyes flickered toward him briefly, and he gave her a small, reassuring nod. He wanted to tell her it was going to be okay, but he knew only time could truly make that happen. They carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. Her body felt fragile, almost as if she might break under too much pressure, and he worried with every step they took. The paramedics wrapped her securely, making sure she was warm and comfortable, and one of them placed a gentle hand on her shoulder to soothe her as they carried her to the ambulance. He followed closely, silently hoping she could feel safe, even for just a moment after all she had been through. Once inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked efficiently, giving her fluids and checking her vital signs. She was shivering, her lips pale, but she was conscious. Every now and then she would glance at him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. He wanted to say something to make her feel better, but he could only watch quietly as the ambulance doors closed and it sped toward the hospital. He stayed behind for a moment, staring at the shed, the empty wooden box now more haunting than ever. The air felt heavier, charged with the memory of what had just happened. His hands trembled slightly, and he realized he had been holding his breath for hours. For the first time, he began to think about the bigger picture. Who could have done this? How long had she been trapped? And why had the box ended up here in his uncle's shed? Word of the discovery spread quickly through the small neighborhood. People emerged from their homes, murmuring in shock as they saw the paramedics drive away. Some whispered about what they had heard. Others simply stared in disbelief. The man answered a few questions, careful not to share details the authorities might need, but he could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing down on him. Everyone wanted to know who the young woman was, how she had ended up trapped, and if the neighborhood was safe. The police arrived shortly after the ambulance left. They were methodical and professional, taking notes, examining the shed, and asking questions. They photographed the wooden box, ran their hands over its surface, and took careful measurements. Every detail mattered. Every scratch, every carving, every mark could be a clue. The man explained how he had found the box, describing exactly how it had been tucked in the corner, almost hidden from view. The officers listened, nodding, and promised that they would do everything they could to find out who was responsible. Despite the police presence, the man felt restless. He couldn't stop thinking about the young woman. He replayed her frightened expression over and over in his mind, remembering the way she had whispered for help and how her hands had trembled in his. It was impossible to shake the feeling that her life had been hanging by a thread, and that if he had been a few minutes later, she might not have survived. At the hospital, doctors and nurses worked quickly. They examined her thoroughly, checking for dehydration, malnutrition, bruises, and injuries. They spoke gently, asking her questions and encouraging her to rest. She responded slowly at first, her voice barely a whisper, but she seemed to realize that she was finally safe. For the first time in what could have been days, she allowed herself to relax, even slightly. The doctors assured her that she would be okay, and they promised to help her recover both physically and emotionally. Meanwhile, the man stayed in touch with the authorities, answering any questions they had and providing all the details he could remember. Every conversation reminded him of how fragile life could be and how easily things could go wrong. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, not only for finding the woman but also for making sure the investigation led to justice. News of the incident spread beyond the neighborhood. Local media outlets picked up the story, drawn by the shocking nature of the discovery. Reporters spoke cautiously, avoiding sensationalism, but the story was compelling. A young woman trapped in a small wooden box, rescued by an ordinary man. The coverage brought attention to the case, and with it pressure on the authorities to solve the mystery quickly. At night, when the neighborhood quieted again, the man found himself unable to sleep. He walked through the shed slowly, examining the empty box one last time, The air smelled faintly of wood and dust, a reminder of the strange and terrifying events of the day. He thought about the young woman, wondering how she had survived, what she had endured, and whether she would ever feel safe again. He realized that life had a way of testing people in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes the smallest acts, like opening an old wooden box, could have the biggest consequences. He sat down on an old chair in the shed, staring at the empty space where the box had been. His mind raced with questions, theories, and fears, but also with a strange sense of purpose. He had been the one to find her, to act, to make the call for help. In the midst of terror and uncertainty, he had become a lifeline. And though the events of the day had left him shaken, they had also reminded him of something powerful, that courage could come in small, quiet moments, often when no one expected it. The night stretched on, and the neighborhood slept, unaware of the depth of the mystery hidden in the small wooden box. He knew the investigation was just beginning, and that the answers would not come easily. But for now, the most important thing was clear. A life had been saved, and the ordinary man who had stumbled upon a shocking secret had become an unexpected hero. The following days were filled with tension and questions. The neighborhood, once quiet and ordinary, now buzzed with whispers and speculation. Everyone wanted to know the story behind the wooden box, the young woman, and how such a shocking event could happen right in their midst. The man who had found her felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because she was alive and receiving care. Anxiety because he couldn't stop thinking about who might have done this or why. Police were busy at the shed, examining every detail carefully. They measured the box, inspected the carvings, and looked for fingerprints or other clues. They also questioned neighbors, checking if anyone had noticed unusual activity in the area. The man provided a detailed account of what he had seen and how he had discovered the box, giving them a clear timeline of events. The officers nodded seriously, taking notes and promising that they would leave no stone unturned. At the hospital, the young woman was slowly regaining strength. The doctors provided her with food, water, and medical care, while also making sure she felt safe. The initial shock had left her fragile, and the emotional trauma was evident. She was hesitant to speak at first, her voice barely above a whisper, but the medical staff encouraged her gently, assuring her that she was no longer in danger. When she finally began to talk, her words were broken and hesitant. She didn't give full names, locations, or reasons at first. Her memories seemed tangled, confused, and painful. But she did reveal that she had been held against her will and confined in small, dark spaces. She mentioned fear, isolation, and the uncertainty of whether anyone would ever find her. Each sentence was spoken slowly, as if even speaking the words required great effort. The man stayed in touch with the authorities, answering their questions and providing details about the box. He also tried to follow updates about her condition at the hospital, hoping she would recover fully. He could not forget the image of her trembling inside the box, her frightened eyes looking at him for help. That moment had changed him, and he realized he could never see life the same way again. Meanwhile, investigators began tracing the origin of the box. They checked antique shops, local carpenters, and old property records. Every lead was followed, every clue carefully analyzed. The carvings on the box became a focal point. They were not random. Someone had put thought and effort into making the box unique, and that detail suggested planning, not chance. The police also examined the shed for signs of tampering, footprints, or other evidence that could help them identify the person responsible. The young woman's memory of her time in captivity returned slowly. She described small details, how the box had felt, the sounds she had heard, and how she had tried to remain calm. She remembered the darkness, the smell, and the constant fear of being discovered. Each memory brought a shiver, but sharing them helped her slowly regain a sense of control. She also expressed a cautious gratitude for the man who had found her, calling him her lifeline, though she struggled to fully understand the luck that had saved her. As the days passed, the man reflected on the fragility of life. He had been cleaning a dusty shed, performing a simple task when he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. A life hung in the balance, and his action, simple, instinctive, human, had made all the difference. He began to appreciate the quiet moments in life, the unnoticed corners, and the importance of paying attention to small details. The police continued their work tirelessly. They discovered small clues on the box, faint traces of materials that could indicate where it had been built or who might have handled it. Neighbors were questioned again and subtle patterns began to emerge. Authorities also began looking into the young woman's past, trying to identify anyone who might have had a motive to harm her. Each day brought new developments, but the case remained complex and solving it required patience and careful analysis. At the hospital, the young woman started interacting more with the staff. She asked questions about the outside world, about life beyond the box, and about whether she could ever return home safely. She also spoke about her fears, the worry that the person who had trapped her might come back or that she might never feel safe again. The hospital staff reassured her, explaining that she was protected and that the authorities were actively working to find those responsible. Throughout all this, the man remained quietly observant. He visited the shed, checking the box one more time, thinking about what it had contained and what it represented. He reflected on the strange intersection of ordinary life and extraordinary events. A simple act, opening a box in a dusty shed, had saved a life and set in motion a complex investigation. He realized how fragile safety could be and how critical human attention and care were in moments of crisis. The story began to attract attention beyond the local neighborhood. Media outlets reported cautiously, focusing on the rescue and the ongoing investigation. The narrative emphasized human courage, the randomness of fate, and the resilience of the young woman. Yet the community remained tense, aware that such an event could happen again and that the person responsible might still be out there. Slowly, small pieces of the puzzle began to come together. The authorities uncovered additional evidence, traced potential leads, and prepared to confront the person responsible. Meanwhile, the young woman's confidence and strength grew, thanks to medical care and the support of those around her. She started to speak more openly, describing her experience in ways that helped her process the trauma. By the end of this phase, there was a cautious sense of hope. The young woman was recovering, the investigation was making progress, and the man who had discovered her felt a mixture of relief and reflection. The days of confusion and fear were giving way to a clearer understanding of what had happened. Yet the shadow of uncertainty remained, a reminder that the past was not easily erased, and that the truth, though coming to light, carried its own weight. The investigation had taken weeks, but finally the pieces began to fit together. The police had traced the wooden box to a distant relative of the young woman, someone who had once been trusted in her life. The carvings, the marks, and the subtle details on the box were enough to link it to this person. It was a shocking revelation, but one that brought some relief. At least now there was hope that justice could be served. The young woman had recovered enough to meet with investigators in person. She was still cautious, still fragile from her ordeal, but there was determination in her eyes. She explained the details she could remember, describing how she had been lured and trapped and how fear had dominated every day she spent in confinement. She was brave enough to recount the small acts of resilience that had kept her alive, the way she tried to remain calm, how she kept her mind occupied and her hope that someone, anyone, would find her. The authorities acted quickly. They confronted the person responsible with the evidence collected, the traces on the box, witness statements, and the young woman's own account. The suspect was caught off guard, and after hours of questioning, they finally admitted to what they had done. The relief was immense for everyone involved, especially for the young woman who could finally feel that a part of her nightmare had ended. In the neighborhood, the news of the resolution spread slowly. People were shocked and saddened that someone they had known, someone connected to the family, could commit such a crime. But there was also a collective sense of relief, a feeling that the story would not end in tragedy, and that safety, while fragile, could be restored. The young woman began the long process of healing, both physically and emotionally. Therapy and counseling helped her process the trauma, and she began to regain confidence in herself and in the world around her. She learned to trust again, though cautiously, and she started to envision a life beyond the shadow of the box and the fear that had dominated her existence. For the man who had discovered her, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though the memory of that day remained vivid. He had gone to the shed for a simple task, and it had changed everything. That ordinary act, moving boxes, opening an old wooden container, had saved a life. He reflected often on the fragility of life, the unexpected nature of events, and the importance of paying attention to the world around him. The small details, the unnoticed corners, had made all the difference. The wooden box itself was taken by the authorities for examination. Experts studied it to understand its construction and to preserve evidence. Eventually, it was kept as part of the investigation file, a reminder of both the danger it had contained and the life it had almost taken. For the man, seeing the box again empty and silent was a strange mix of relief and unease. It represented both horror and hope, a symbol of what could happen in the shadows of ordinary life. The young woman, despite everything, chose to share her story publicly in a measured way. She spoke about survival, resilience, and the importance of vigilance. Her story became a quiet inspiration to others, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope and courage could make a difference. She emphasized that no one should feel shame or fear for seeking help, and her voice became an important part of the community's understanding of safety and care. As time passed, the neighborhood began to heal. People returned to their routines, but the story remained in their minds, a reminder that extraordinary events can unfold in the most ordinary places. The man continued his work, quietly reflecting on the day that changed everything. He often thought about the young woman's resilience, the courage it took to survive, and the random chain of events that had led him to the shed. He realized that life was fragile, but also that human actions, simple, instinctive, compassionate acts, could have profound impacts. The young woman eventually moved forward with her life, building new routines, reconnecting with family members she trusted, and finding small joys that had once seemed impossible. She never forgot the man who had found her, and she occasionally sent messages of gratitude, letting him know that she was safe and beginning to rebuild her life. For both of them, life was forever changed. One small act, opening a strange wooden box, had revealed a hidden story, tested courage, and ultimately brought justice and hope. It was a reminder of the power of ordinary people to change lives, the importance of vigilance, and the resilience of the human spirit. Even years later, the man would sometimes think about that dusty shed, the hidden box, and the young woman he had saved. The memory was vivid but no longer terrifying. It was a story of survival, humanity, and unexpected heroism, a story that reminded him and everyone who heard it that life can be fragile, mysterious, and miraculous all at once. And in that small neighborhood, the echoes of that day remained, not as fear, but as a testament to courage, attention, and the extraordinary impact of simple human actions.